Think Forward. Think Research Channel.
There's a structural problem with genocide, which is that it tends to happen in places that are off the beaten path.
So now, in order to promote nonviolence and reduce violence, ultimately we have to address the motivation.
Society needs to acknowledge that learning is a lifelong challenge.
The sit-ins challenge cherished beliefs most whites held dearly.
At the DNA level, we're all 99.9% the same. All of us.
So individuals do matter. And I think the quality of our individual leadership matters.
Who is speaking for poor people? 40 million Americans make $6 an hour. Who is speaking for them?
The only thing that one has after throwing everything overboard is the love that one can give.
I want to begin with a couple of questions about the Brown decision. I know you were just 7 years old in 1954 when the court ruled, but do you have any recollections of what it meant to you at the time or conversations about it in the family?
It actually made a huge difference because it was in that year, or maybe the year after, that we moved from what was the heart of Chicago's Black Belt into what was then a neighborhood that was on the cutting edge of integration. And as a result of Brown, I was able to go to a public school that, starting in the third grade, that had previously been all white, that had not been mixed at all. And we had some traumas as a result of it. We did the old, this was also the time when the whole nuclear scare, as you recall, and so when the toughs would go by our school and throw rocks at the windows, we would get under our desks and do duck and cover. Remember that duck and cover?
Yes, yeah.
So we did duck and cover as in the face of opposition to school desegregation in Chicago. And then, of course, later, my father, who was himself an activist, joined with Al Raby and something called the community. I forget the name of the CCC, I forget what it all stood for, but that was a group organized to protest the segregation of Chicago schools. They were using...
which later brought Dr. King to Chicago.
Which later brought Dr. King to Chicago, exactly. Well, he did for schools and housing, because I actually marched with him on the housing march, yes. But they were using something called Willis wagons. The superintendent of schools was Ben Willis. And in order to keep the overcrowding in the black schools from putting pressure for integration on the formerly all-white schools, he used these trailers. And so you had in the black neighborhoods trailers to augment the population for the population of black students, and often undercrowding in the white schools. And so the CCC started to protest that and to say, you know, Brown versus Board of Education requires that these schools be integrated to the extent possible, and we just have to get it going on, get it fixed here in Chicago.
Do you remember at the time, at this young age in 54 and even in 55, when you go to this new school, having any larger thoughts about what this meant to the larger world, the larger United States, what Brown might mean nationwide?
Well, no, to be honest. At that point, I didn't. I did later. We had kind of an unusual household because my parents considered themselves, at least my father, well, no, my parents, they were not bohemians is the wrong word, but that we were surrounded by artists and musicians, and so people from a lot of different walks of life. So we always had an integrated household, but there was always discussion of race relations and the kinds of developments in the larger community. And so even as a small child, I was really acutely aware of the efforts of people to build an integrated society.
And probably, I'm guessing, hopeful about it, that this would be a good thing and it will happen and things will be better?
Well, I just assumed, you see, I mean, for me, again, because as a child, there were black people and there were white people in my family and what I consider to be my family. There were Asians in my family. And so I kind of grew up in this multicultural milieu and didn't really see firsthand the problems. The earliest recollection is actually a hilarious story. The earliest recollection I have, my great-grandfather had the farm, bought a farm in Alabama, that's still in the family, and we would go there in the summer times, and I couldn't have been more than 8, maybe 10, 9 or 10 years old, and we would take the train down, and when we got off in Montgomery, I think it was Montgomery, yes, it was Montgomery, and got off the train with my mother, myself, my mother, my little brother. We were thirsty, but the water fountains were segregated, you know, the white water fountains for white and water fountains for colored, and my mother wouldn't let us drink out of the colored water fountain. And so my little brother laid in the middle of the floor, screamed and had a temper tantrum. I want some colored water, I want some colored water. He thought it was going to come out green and blue and purple and yellow and red, and so he was determined to have some colored water.
Well, now we're 51 years away from the Brown decision in '54, and what do you think it has turned out to mean?
I think it's had very mixed reviews, to be honest. On the one hand, the integration of the schools was achieved on some levels, and certainly in regards to faculty, in regards to hiring, those kinds of things have occurred pretty much across the country. On the other, I think it has given rise to the ghettoization, if you will, of public education, because a lot of the constituency to pay for the public schools evaporated, vanished in the post-Brown environment. There are those who say there are a lot of different reasons for it, and race and integration was not the only reason. But I think it's pretty. I imagine it's documentable. I don't know, but when you look at the level of public support for public education nationwide, it is so diminished from the standing, if you will, of public education 50 years ago, from the kind of financial support that communities gave to public education. Now that's a phenomenon across the board with education, even at the higher levels, I think. But at the same time, I think that the constituency for public education was changed by the Brown decision more than anything else.
I read something you said in 1994 that the most interesting change in America since '54 is the way in which attitudes about life station have changed. What did you mean by that?
The notion that blacks were relegated to a particular set of roles in the society, that women were relegated to a particular set of roles in society, that ethnicity would limit people in terms of what they could do, and so what was considered the concept of station in life, I think has changed the most, and that was what the whole cultural revolution of the 50s and 60s I think reflected more than anything else, was the change in attitudes about station, and therefore a series of realignments and adjustments in the way that we define civil society.
By any standard, you are a remarkably accomplished person, by any standard.
Oh, thank you.
Have you ever thought that the Brown decision, but for the Brown decision, that you might be a very different person?
Oh, there's no question about it. There's no question about it. I mean, when I look back at people such as yourself, and I don't want to speak over much, but the fact of the matter is that the role that you played, that Dr. King played, that Andy Young, and all of the leadership of the civil rights movement from those days, it transformed this country and opened up doors and made it possible for people like myself to come through and to have the accomplishments that are now part of my resume. There's no way I would have been able to go to Ruggles Elementary or to get into the University of Chicago or to become a senator, ambassador, and all this other stuff. None of it would have happened but for the efforts of people who actually took their own lives at risk to open up, integrate, and change civil society in the United States.
Who are the people who've been most significant in shaping you, in creating you, in helping you develop?
Well, other than my parents, which is pretty obvious, I've been blessed to have people come into my life at pivotal moments and make all the difference. When I dropped out of college, dropped out of high school really, a fellow by the name of Larry Hawkins, who's still at the University of Chicago, essentially just turned my whole vision around and suggested to me that I could go on. In those days they called it broadening your horizons. So Larry Hawkins made a great difference at that point in my life. When I got to, I'm probably leave somebody out, but when I got to the state legislature, a woman named Ethel Alexander, who was elected at the same time that I was, but she was a generation older. I mean, in fact, I'm old enough to be her daughter, young enough to be her daughter. She made a huge difference. And so there are people along the way who touched my life at times when I might have taken one road or another, and by their influence in my life made a big difference.
Now, you mentioned your mother and father a moment ago and said that they weren't bohemians, but they were people living in the artistic world and had people in the house. What about them?
Oh, well, my parents they had an unusual marriage to begin with. I mean, there was a tumultuous marriage, but at the same time, and they were opposites. My mother was very, she called it firesides and slippers. She wasn't social. She had a little group of people that gravitated to her. She was very, in that regard, seen kind of as an earth mother that attracted people. But she wasn't all that outgoing. My father, on the other hand, was very outgoing and was involved in movements and causes and always engaged with the outside world. And so, as a result, he was a police officer or in law enforcement in some role or another as his day gig, if you will, but he played 7 instruments. And so he played the saxophone part-time professionally. And so because he was in the Saul Hicks band, I actually have a picture of the band and my mother sitting on the sidelines. I guess she was singing that night or something. But so he played in a band, and the result was that the musicians of that time, were very much part of our household. And so I grew up, I knew Gene Ammons, I knew Bird, Charlie Parker, I knew...
Charlie Parker?
Absolutely. Thelonious Monk. My aunt dated Dexter Gordon for a while. So all these musicians were around, as I was growing up. And in addition to the musicians, there were the artists. Inevitably, where you find musicians, you find artists. And so I just grew up around the arts. And that, I don't know, by osmosis or otherwise, but that also, I think, influenced my worldview.
I read someplace that you described the difference between your mother and father as the difference between Booker T. Washington and W.B. Du Bois. How did that play out?
That's exactly right. I didn't realize I had done that, but yes, that's exactly right. Well, because she was very much, in fact, she had an expression that you grow where you're planted. You do the best job you can where you're planted. And her expression was, whether you're a street sweeper or the President of the United States, you do the best job you can at what you're doing and be proud of your work. So she was very much this is the job, this is the task, focus on not having ambitions, not seeing a world outside of the home and the family as being all that relevant. He, on the other hand, did see the world and was very concerned about what was going on in the world and did what he could in his way to make a difference and to change things. And so his social activism, I think, was born of that. And so I grew up, again, in addition to the musicians and the artists, I met a woman by the name of Anna Langford, was the
Sure.
the first black female alderwoman in Chicago, and he took me to Anna Langford's office when I was 11, so that I would meet a black woman alderman. And there was another woman judge, Edith Sampson, and he took me to meet her.
And what about your father's political activism? How did that come to you?
It was a generation apart, but he worked for the first. He was always against the machine. And this is important in terms of Chicago politics, because people think of Chicago politics and they think of the daily machine. Well, there was always a group of independents out there who saw the machine as antithetical to the civil rights movement, antithetical to good government and honesty and reform in government. And so that was always the side of the equation that he found that he was on or found himself on. And so he worked in the campaign of the first, one of the early black politicians to challenge the daily machine. That was Charlie Chu. And Charlie Chu ran as a reform candidate. And my father was in real estate at that time. And the office that he and his partner had, when they had a meeting for Charlie Chu, the city inspectors came and told him that the water was leaking and the gas was da-da-da, and so they basically shut him down, put him out of business for a little while. So you can imagine there was no small amount of real anger and antipathy toward the daily machine in our household. And it was funny too, because years later, of course, I got to know Rich Daley, the son, and there was no small amount of irony. I don't think Rich Daley ever really understood or appreciated what a big leap that was for me, because our household had been absolutely just anti-Daley down the road.
But was there dinner table discussion about politics, about the machine, about Illinois politics?
Yes.
United States politics, all of that going on?
Probably. He wasn't so much, he was active in local campaign efforts and in union campaign efforts and things like putting people to work on the street. There was a streetcar fight, to get blacks jobs working for the transportation company. He would do things like that. But his political vision was really more national and international.
And a moment ago you mentioned marching with Dr. King in the housing struggles in Chicago. Tell us about that. How old were you then?
I think I was 15. Now I'd have to check. I was either 15 or 16. I was still in high school. And my mother had cautioned me, again, back to, by this point they were split up. And so we were with my mother, and I remember her saying, you don't want to get mixed up with that. You might get in trouble, and there's bound to be trouble. And of course, that was just my sign that, I had to go, obviously, to the march at that point. So I went over, and it was marching, we marched down, I think it was 67th Street. I have a sense that we marched down Marquette Boulevard to get to Gage Park. And I was paired with a veteran, a guy who had marched in the South, a white guy who had marched in the South. And there were some nuns in front of me. And I remember, it's just as vividly as if it was yesterday, because that's that kind of a turning point. And we marched, and the rocks in the bottles started flying. And the guy with whom I was marching was hit by a rock, and or a piece of glass, something. Blood started coming down his face. And of course, I'm just horrified at this point, like, oh my God. He just took his handkerchief out and put it up there and stopped it. And then the cat calls were coming from the sides. And I remember, having, again, grown up in a Catholic, more or less Catholic family, the nuns who were marching in front of me were being called all kinds of horrible names, and when was the last time you slept with that black whatever sister, so it's like, so I was horrified at that. There was a guy standing by the side of the road who was my age, young, a little bit younger actually, probably 12, 13, and he was yelling, "Semi-humans go home, semi-humans go home." And I looked at him and I caught his eye and I said, "It's not semi-humans, it's semi." He says, "Oh, thanks." Semi-humans go home, semi-humans go home. So we marched and got into the park itself, and the violence was so horrible. There was no, I don't recollect gunshots, but I know it was rocks and bottles and bricks and glass. And so what they did was they put the women and children in the middle of a circle, and then the activists around that, and then the hardcore activists were the outside perimeter. And it got so bad, Dr. King was moved to the middle of the circle. And so he was as close to me as, this go right over there. I mean, literally touching distance almost. And I remember, because you're supposed to cover your head up like this, and we're down on the ground and covering up, and he was standing there and looking just as calm and sanguine in the face of all this. And I remember, literally, it was an epiphany for me, because I was frankly ready to throw something back. I mean, that was my first reaction, was, okay, next rock falls near me is going right back out there. But the epiphany at that moment for me was what I came to understand to be the real message and the real power of nonviolence, which was that by standing there and by his example of peaceful resistance, by his example of claiming the moral high ground, by his response, he had the victory, and that had he stooped, he would have been on the same level as the people against whom he was fighting. And so it was in that experience that I became committed, really, to nonviolence and to his movement, as opposed to that of some of my friends who at that time were beginning to gravitate in the direction of, the Panthers and, get the gun and, shoot back and all the rest of it.
Now earlier, because your mother and father separated, you move into a neighborhood that's got a spectacular name. What's that name?
The Bucket of Blood.
What was that like? What was the change like for you?
It was really very traumatic for all of us. But in a way, I'll tell you, it's funny, it's one of those life traumas that I'm grateful for now. It probably set my brother on a path to his destruction. But I don't think I would be as rounded or as grounded, if you will, in the Black experience if it hadn't been for that. Because we grew up, in a community that, for all intents and purposes, was suburban, in a family that, again, among Blacks, we weren't rich people by any means, but we were considered to be well off, but well off in a different kind of environment. My parents weren't social enough to be part of the Black, what was the Black bourgeoisie, right? They weren't that, the club structure and all the rest. They weren't part of that, but they were part of that other, the Black intellectuals, that tradition. That's more where they were. And so I really did not have a real sense of what the poverty was like, of what the really the kind of degradation that came of the kind of grinding poverty that the urban ghettos represented. I had seen poverty before, okay, particularly on the farm. I mean, we spent our summers on a farm, and so I'd seen people, living in houses with dirt floors and the outhouse, and I knew all of that, but I hadn't seen it with people piled in tenements and rats running around biting babies and kids getting shot on the street corner.
And what did that do to you or for you?
I think it really did. I think it helped round out and helped me develop in important ways. It gave me an understanding and an appreciation of the effects of not just slavery, Jim Crow, but of oppression, and particularly economic oppression, that I would not have otherwise had. It gave me another kind of vision about my own life commitment and my own path, and that vision then included trying to do what I could to try to push back and to be a force in opposition to the forces that had created the poverty that I experienced.
Now, I'm guessing now that that's one reason you decided to become a lawyer. Is that right? Mm-hmm. What did you think that would give you?
A bunch of skills. I thought being a lawyer, in fact, to answer your question, I thought being a lawyer would give me the ability to use the law, which of course is the instrument in a large sense of social control, right? Mm-hmm. To use that instrument in constructive and positive ways to help build community, to help people have opportunity and have a chance to have a better life. And when I first got out of law school, in fact, I turned down an offer from one of the biggest firms in Chicago to sign on to a community-based organization that I would use my legal skills, my training rather, to work in the community. And so that was my first commitment. And when that didn't work out, I became an assistant U.S. attorney. And of course, my father called me a paper pusher for the government. He said, "Oh, you become a paper pusher for the government." But that was my path. I really thought I was going to use law.
Were there lawyers in Chicago or elsewhere in the country or the world that you said, "I want to be like that"?
Oh, sure. Yes, Jules Lafontaine was this model of elegance, and she was just the cat's pajamas as far as I was concerned. And so I looked up to her. Again, I mentioned Anna Langford and Edith Sampson, both of whom I had met. I knew, of course, everybody knew about Thurgood Marshall and the legal defense team from the NAACP. I mean, everybody knew about them. And so that was a real model, because these were people who had used the law to transform society. And so, yes, there were a lot of role models in that regard.
And what was being an assistant DA? What was that like?
Wonderful training. Wonderful training. I could not have asked for better. I didn't like the criminal side, to be honest. I did some criminal prosecutions. Didn't like it much. I did some appellate work. I, in fact, helped write the brief on the first RICO case, racketeering and organized crime. We had the first RICO case in Illinois in regards to the prosecution of the former governor of Illinois, the Kerner case. So I got a chance to work on some really high-profile cases there, but I preferred the civil ones. And the good thing about that was that it gave me a real taste of the structure and operation of the law that I wouldn't have had otherwise, and a real taste of policy issues in ways that I wouldn't have had otherwise. I mean, I got to third chair the lawsuit that the American Medical Association brought against Jimmy Carter's healthcare reforms. And so as a result, I read every dot and tittle of the healthcare laws. Well, my views of how healthcare was structured that I developed at that point helped to shape my views on healthcare even to this day. And so because of the grounding that I got there, I was involved with some environmental cases that helped to shape where I wound up on environmental law. And so there were a variety of housing and healthcare and the poverty cases, all of the cases that I got a chance to try. And of course you got great trial experience because you're in court every day. Helped me develop an appreciation for the issues in a way that I don't think I could have gotten any other way.
Now, how did you move from that, which sounds fascinating to me, to running for the legislature? What's the transition here?
Being a homemaker.
Yes. You mean you got tired of being in the home?
Well, I was pregnant with my son Matt, and my husband wanted a stay-at-home mom, and I had no problem with that. And so I had my son, and I was a homemaker. And he today says that I was bored out of my mind, and that he always knew I wasn't just going to stay home.
Is he right?
I don't know. I mean, see, I look back and romanticize it. I mean, I look back to having dinner parties, which is what I did. I had dinner parties, and I'd take my son to the park. I had a little carriage, and obviously, and I'd go to the market, and I mean, I just all did, I did things in the home. I was a homemaker and took care of my family, and it was actually through that my first my state rep first foray into elective politics happened. Because I would take Matt up to the park. We lived 2 blocks from this large park, and I'd take Matt to the park, and while I was up there was a group of people protesting the machine, building a golf driving range in the habitat of some bobolinks, which are rice birds. And bobolinks are not supposed to live in Chicago because it's too cold, but they did. And we wanted to keep the bobolinks where they wanted to, protect their habitat. So I joined the protesters. And in fact, there's still a picture. A friend sent me a copy of it. A picture of me with the sign, Park District no, bobolinks yes. So we were walking around protesting the Park District. And we lost the battle. The driving range is still there. And I don't know what happened to the bobolinks. But anyway, but from that, a woman who was one of the protesters was very involved politically. And so when our state representative retired, I met her, again, pushing Matt down the street, and she stopped me and said, the state rep just announced his retirement. Have you considered running for the state legislature? I think you'd be good at it. And I went, oh, shucks, not me, oh, no, I got a little baby, and, the rest. And then then she said, well, come go with me to the community meeting about this. And so I told her I would, and I went to the community meeting. And this guy stood up and said, don't run, you can't possibly win. The blacks won't vote for you because you're not part of the Chicago machine. The whites won't vote for you because you're black, and nobody's going to vote for you because you're a woman. And it was like, okay, where do I sign up? Where do I sign up for this job? I mean, that was literally what did it.
And then one of the things you do when you get there is you file a lawsuit against the speaker?
Yeah, well, that was a little later. That was like 5 years later. Yes, but when the 1980, it wasn't that much longer than this now that you mention it, because it was the 80 reapportionment, so the lawsuit was filed in 1982 when they actually, did it. When they went to reapportion the state legislature, my own party won in Illinois, we have a tradition that the parties pull a piece of paper out of Abraham Lincoln's hat, literally. So you go into Abraham Lincoln's hat and pull out this piece of paper to determine who gets the right to draw the lines if there's a tie, and that's what happened. So the Democrats drew Abraham Lincoln's hat, got the favor of the hat that time, and drew the maps. And the maps as drawn absolutely eliminated any Hispanic representation, even though we had 2 huge Hispanic communities in Chicago, and minimized to the absolute fewest number of seats possible the seats in which blacks could likely elect a representative. And it was just wrong. And so, I did what I could as fighting it in the legislature through the process, and we lost. We were outvoted. And walking down the street, again, my street kept getting me in trouble. Walking down the street, and this guy with dreadlocks, who was a community activist, you know the type, right? They got long hair, the coats are too big and hanging off, and he's got books under his arms. And he says, well, this is terrible what's happened. Somebody ought to file a law. And he says, this is just a travesty, that the lines will be drawn that way. And I said, well, we tried. That's the only thing I think can happen now is that somebody files a lawsuit. And he looked at me and said, well, you're a lawyer, ain't you? I'm like, oh, well. So he sucked me in. And so I wound up, matter of fact, it was really funny because he said, well, you won't. I said, I couldn't possibly. I don't have a law firm. I'm just, by myself. Oh, don't worry. We'll get you a battery of lawyers and we'll put it together. Well, he showed up that evening with a guy who also had dreadlocks, was probably high on pot and talking about the UN Declaration of Human Rights. So I knew I was in trouble. Right. I was like, oh, my goodness, I don't do this. So I wound up drawing the lawsuit up in my dining room table. And I had called a friend with one of the big law firms who said that he thought his firm would handle it pro bono. This is another time when serendipity played such a role in my life, because I took my papers, because the canons of ethics say you don't file lawsuits that you can't handle, and I knew there was no way that I could handle a 3-judge district court, huge litigation like this on my own. But I filed the case, and just to make the record, I think it got that much notice in the newspaper, if any. And then went down to this law firm to talk with the lawyers about what they would do to handle this reapportionment case, and they turned me down.
Really?
They said, oh no, we're not going to get in, that's too much political hot potato, and they turned me down. And I remember I was so crushed. My friend was embarrassed because he thought he had worked all this out. And I was on the verge of tears because I knew that the only thing I could do is go up to the courtroom and withdraw. There's just no. And as I was coming down out of the elevator, I was going out just as Tom Sullivan was coming in. Tom Sullivan I'd met only on one other occasion when I tendered my resignation to him as U.S. Attorney. Because when I left to have the baby, he came on as U.S. Attorney so he was coming on just as I was going out the door, basically. So I'd only met him once, but he waved, and I waved back, and he said, so I went around, and he says, oh, so what are you doing these days? And, oh, well, so I told him the reapportionment story. And he said, that sounds really interesting. Send us the papers. And Tom, at that point, was a lawyer at Jenner and Block, one of the biggest law firms in Chicago. And Jeff Coleman was with him, was his partner. I guess Jeff was his understudy, his second chair. And they took the case like 40 going north. They're both Democrats, obviously, but they thought, yes, this is the right thing to do. And they took up the case with a commitment that Dick Newhouse, also involved with this, that Dick and I stay involved, that we don't just give them the case and get lost. And we committed to do that. And I remember working harder than I probably have worked on anything in my life, because we had to coordinate. We had got community people to do the computer work. We had the first computer program for reapportionment was written by this black guy who was a street person, basically, in Chicago. And he sat there and did the math, and we put together, because they didn't have such things, the computers were so new, but he put together a program to run the numbers, the census numbers, so we could do the case. And we would spend nights sitting in my study at my house going over papers and trying to work the numbers out. And then Ethel, who was our kind of secret spy, because she was very much a part of the machine. She had been my roommate, Ethel Alexander, but she was very much a part of the machine, and so, in fact, was called as a witness against us. But the full story was that she had sat down with me with colored pencils one night and shown me the machine dynamics of who had done what to whom, and why these lines were here and not there, and how they managed to work it out. And so that allowed us to produce a theory about the case that allowed us not only to win, but we made real history, because it was the first time that a reapportionment case had been won in the North. Remember, the Voting Rights Act originally was limited just to the southern states. It was the first time the Voting Rights Act was extended. Well, it happened in two stages. We first had to make a pure 14th Amendment case, which was to say that there was deliberate discrimination, which the Speaker of the Illinois House has never forgiven me for, because the court had to say he deliberately intended to discriminate. But then after that decision by the three-judge court, the Congress acted to extend the Voting Rights Act nationwide, so the South wasn't just singled out anymore. And then under the Voting Rights Act case, the test just got easier. But it set up really the direction that the courts have followed, well, up until fairly recently, but the courts followed for a number of years in reapportionment cases. The case was Crosby versus State Board of Elections. But the really good news, I thought, from that was not only in that case, we created the first Hispanic district ever, and which gave rise subsequently to a Hispanic coming to Congress, but we also created additional black districts in Illinois. But as much to the point, it didn't happen again. I mean, that was the last time that the party apparatus went out of their way to try to, if you will, stick it to their minority base as a way of keeping white politicians in power. I think so.
Yeah. Now, how do you go from that to thinking that you can run against an incumbent U.S. senator?
Well,
a Democrat in a Democratic state.
I know. Well, see, I was leaving politics. It's like that Michael Corleone joke about, I keep trying to leave the mafia, but it keeps pulling me back,
yes.
Right? Well, that's what happened with my political career. Every time I got ready to leave, it just pulled me right on back in. And after the reapportionment case, everybody told me I was going to get run out of town on a rail. But that didn't happen because Harold Washington was elected mayor. And when Harold, who was also an independent, who was an ally, a political ally, when he got elected mayor, he wanted his person to be his spokesman in Springfield. So instead of getting run out, I became assistant majority leader. So broke down some more, because that was the first time ever you can imagine somebody looked like me was the assistant majority leader. So I did that during Harold's first term. And then I was ready to leave Springfield. I was ready to leave the legislature. I was ready to leave politics, actually, because my own marriage had begun to founder. I was ready to come back home and go and practice law. And I also had a set of experiences. I was another person that came at a pivotal time, a woman by the name of Caroline Craycraft, found me through Leon and Marion Dupre. Leon Dupre was a great independent activist in Chicago politics. And she signed me up for something called the European Communities Visitors Program. And essentially it's something sponsored by the EU that lets young people who are involved in government or whatever in the community travel and get a view of the European community. So I traveled just as my marriage was breaking up. I wound up going and spending a couple months just kind of backpacking around in Europe. And so that had an impact, particularly later, in terms of my view and where I wound up, particularly with regard to the Senate. So anyway, and I came back ready to go into a private practice. But Harold prevailed upon, he said, no, Bobby Rush, in fact, had a lot to do with this. Bobby said, we don't want to lose you to politics. It's not time yet.
Was he an alderman by then?
Bobby was at the time, yes, he was alderman, and I had known Bobby from the Panther days. In fact, Bobby and Fred Hampton, I knew Fred Hampton, one of my closest friends in those days, Christina May, had to go underground as a Panther. And so, we were all kind of generationally linked to each other. And so Bobby said, no, you can't leave. And so Harold had the idea of me standing for countywide office. And he said, because there'd never been a black, there'd never been a woman, there'd never been a Hispanic, nobody. I mean, it had always been just kind of the old boys network for real. And so I told him, okay, well, I'd do it, at that point, well, why not? So right after I said I would, and frankly, even as I was having second thoughts about doing it, Harold died. And then it was almost like you had to, because he had this, Harold Washington had a way with words, and he announced the dream ticket, and the dream ticket was comprised of women and men, black, white, brown, Asian. I mean, that we were everybody. It was the dream ticket, representing the whole community. And then, like I said, within a couple of weeks, he was gone, not even that long. So I ran for, and was elected Recorder of Deeds of Cook County, which was a countywide office. And again, I was not, I wanted to do the best job I could while I was planted. So I did what I could in that office, in that countywide office, and reformed the office, and I think we did some really good things there. But I was going to leave again. I mean, I was going to go into the private sector. And that's when the first President Bush nominated Clarence Thomas to the United States Supreme Court. And again, going back and reflecting on how important Thurgood Marshall had been, how important the Warren Court was, that my whole life would not have been possible had it not been for the whole series of cases that the Warren Court decided. Everything starting with Hansberry versus Lee. Lorraine Hansberry's parents' home started the housing desegregation. That was in the neighborhood near the high school that I attended. So Hansberry versus Lee, Brown versus Board, you've mentioned, Loving versus Virginia. I was in an interracial marriage. I mean, so you go just everything along the way. The court was that kind of important in my own personal life, not just in kind of esoteric, theoretical grounds. It was something that was very personal. And I remember I wrote to my senator, both Senator Dixon and Senator Simon, and there was no question but Senator Simon was going to oppose the nomination. Alan Dixon, however, and by the way, both the senators were from the southern part of the state, so it wasn't like it was a north-south kind of thing, even though Illinois very much has kind of that divide, if you will. It wasn't north-south because Paul was clear that he was going to resist the Thomas nomination. Alan, on the other hand, was being more coy about it and wouldn't tell people what he was going to do, really. The suspicion was he was going to support Thomas, but it wasn't true. So I remember even having a conversation because he heard that there were a group of us out there just so outraged, particularly after the Anita Hill thing happened. I had been against, in fact, I had done a television program before we knew about Anita Hill. I'd done 2 of them, opposing the Thomas nomination and saying, we can do better for the Supreme Court. This is not a replacement for Thurgood Marshall. And then the Senate took a break. There was the hiatus, as you recall, and then the Anita Hill allegations were made. And when that happened, that was just salt in the wound or fuel in the fire. And I remember having a face-to-face, one-on-one conversation with Senator Dixon and saying to him, you can't support this nomination. It will be a slap in the face to every woman, every black person, everybody who's supported you up till now. It will absolutely be contrary to our interests and send a horrible signal for young people who are Democrats that this party does not have its moral compass in good working order, that this party does not stand on the high ground when it comes to issues of civil rights. Well, he kind of, he was known, and the man's still alive, so I don't mean to disparage him, but he was known as Al the Pal, right? So he was always, hi, how you doing, and so he gave me, oh, don't worry about it, and then he turned around and voted for Clarence Thomas, and then went away for a couple of days, or his phones were shut off for a few days, and the women just went crazy and said, there was 3 of us who were looking at running. One was a prominent socialite. Another was a federal judge, former federal judge, and me. And I was the only one who had run for office before. And so the people, as the organizers came together, the women primarily from National Organization for Women and from other women's groups, got behind my candidacy. And, at the time it was, she doesn't really have a snowball's chance, but I was out there and I was running and running hard. And that's how it got started. And it wasn't with the real concern that I was going to win or lose, just that I was just trying to do the right thing.
And that really is the year of the women, because all over the country women are energized by this the Thomas nomination and the votes for him, and many, many women are elected public office. Let me tell you something I remember about that race, because I was in Georgia at the time, it's in Illinois, I couldn't follow it very closely, and I knew Dixon to be kind of a hack. But I thought his concession speech was the most gracious thing I had ever heard in my life, and I was so surprised because I didn't think it would come from him. I was just taken aback by him. I think I wrote him a little congratulatory letter, which is something I wouldn't do. It was just, it was the decent thing to do from someone whom you didn't expect.
Graciousness.
Yes, at all. So now you get to the U.S. Senate, and that's an entirely different experience. It's a unique experience in American life. And not only are you a woman, there have been women before, but you're the first black woman. And I read someplace where you thought people couldn't talk about this, couldn't mention this, because they're so unused to discussing race. What did your colleagues say about race, about you? Or did they just act like you weren't black?
Oh, no. I mean, if anything, race was the 800-pound gorilla in the room, always. When I was sworn in, some civil rights leaders who remain nameless, who had nothing to do with my election, showed up and taking credit for my election.
I know their name.
And we were all sitting on the stage, and people were giving, and Strom Thurmond showed up, and one of my girlfriends, in fact, started to boo, and of course the crowd of people who came were just entirely too civilized to let that happen. They shut her up, so shushed her. And everybody was standing there literally in shocked disbelief, because Strom at this point, as you can imagine, was 9,000 years old, and barely, if he knew he was in the Senate, I would be surprised. But he made it a point to come to say a few words at the podium at my swearing in. And I laughed about it afterwards because it was so funny. It was part of him, this is the new face of Strom Thurmond that he was showing at the time. So race was the 800-pound gorilla in all of it, and did play a role. And frankly, I didn't realize until you learn from experience, but there were some aspects of my tenure that were absolutely tinged and colored by race. The aspects is the wrong word, it's expectations. There were expectations having to do with race that I didn't fully appreciate until, obviously after the fact.
Of all the things you did in the Senate, the things people are going to remember is your clash with Jesse Helms. And I'm curious as to how you came across this little item in legislation, and it had to be small and innocuous appearing. How did you come across that, and when did you make a decision, I'm going to do something about this? This is an attempt to protect the patent that the Daughters of the Confederacy have on the symbol of the Confederacy, not the flag, but the symbol. How did you see that, and how did you decide what to do?
Well, you know, this again may sound corny. I was just doing my job. It came up first in committee. My staffer, you know, we review the bills. My staffer's name was Jeff Gibbs. He's a lawyer out in California now. And we're going over the bills that were coming up, and he's rattling off da-da-da-da-da. And he said, but Senator, he says, this patent for Olestra, you know, the fat drug, the fat substitute, this patent for Olestra has a Confederate flag attached to it. I'm going, what? You know, how did this happen? And we found that the Confederate flag patent that had been held by the United Daughters of the Confederacy had actually been renewed twice before. They'd had it since the 1920s. And I'm saying to myself, you know, then I went into my lawyer mode. What do they need a patent for on the flag? I mean, you know, that's you think in terms of copyright, if anything, but not a patent. Well, so I went to the chairman of the committee and I said, well, you know, this part is not acceptable. I mean, you know, number one, I mean, the Confederate flag doesn't belong on a bill. It doesn't belong with a patent to begin with. Second, it doesn't belong on this bill. And third, you know, I cannot in conscience support it, and I'd like your help in opposing it. And the chairman, who actually has been very good on issues of race ever since, as far as I'm aware, started going humming and shifting in his chair, and I couldn't figure out why. You know, it was just such a no-brainer to me. Like, oh, you know, why is this complicated for you? Well, it turned out that it was complicated in part because it was Strom's bill.
Helms' bill.
It was Strom's
bill.
Strom's bill.
And Jesse Helms is carrying it for him?
Jesse Helms had nothing to do with it at this point. That was another piece of the whole thing. It was Strom's bill. And the other members of the committee, since he was senior and I'm, you know, just got there, didn't want to offend him. So I actually had to lobby it in committee. And I lobbied, I talked to all the members, I got my votes lined up, and I won. We stripped it off the bill in committee. And I thought that was the end of it. Then on a day, again, back to race again, we were in committee on the confirmation hearings for Justice Breyer. And Orrin Hatch, who actually on a personal level I got along with very well, started arguing against, the issue came up about freedom of choice. And Orrin began to make the argument that Roe v. Wade, the decision on choice, was the legal equivalent of Plessy versus Ferguson. Now you may have heard that since, but at the time I was absolutely shocked. Plessy, you know, Plessy being the decision that a black man has no rights, that a white man need respect. So I'm sitting there going, what? I was just absolutely horrified that he would say such a thing. But then I was really nervous because I'm thinking, okay, I'm a freshman on the committee. This is one of my first Supreme Court justice confirmations. This is a big deal. It's on television. Oh my God. And so, but I just couldn't let it pass. And I said, you know, point of clarification, and I got into a legal discussion, an argument with Orrin Hatch about whether Roe v. Wade and Plessy versus Ferguson were comparable. And trying to keep my voice modulated, because I was really, I mean, infuriated and insulted. So I'm going through this and I'm really nervous, and in the middle of this, my staffer, and Jeff Gibbs again, came over with a note that said, Jesse Helms has just taken to the floor to revive the Confederate flag patent. And I sat there thinking at that moment, I'll never forget, I said, what did I do today to deserve this? I mean, it was like, Lord, what did I do to deserve this day? So I had to get up, leave the hearing, and go across the street, you know, go over to the Capitol to take on Jesse Helms. And if you review the proceedings at all, the first part of my argument on the floor was really as dispassionate and as legalistic and formalistic as I could make it. It was, you know, Mr. Speaker, this has already been decided by committee. It came off, da 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 da. I mean, it was just a legal argument, thinking that the rules would apply. You know, the committee's already decided this. It'll, you know, for Jesse Helms to come back and try to revive it was just out of form. And then that it shouldn't be a patent in any event. And I mean, again, I would boop, 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 hear the argument. And when I looked up and the Senate had voted to restore the patent, I was incensed. It was like, oh no, this can't be. And that's when the if you will, the real debate. And when Paul Simon and Joe Biden and some of the others, particularly Joe, because Joe was on the committee and had known the issue. So when the committee members first came around, Pat Leahy, when they started coming around to say, this is why the committee decided, and then the debate broadened from just a purely legalistic one into the import, the meaning of the Confederate flag in modern day America. And when, by the time, how can I blank on his name? Judge from Alabama.
Not Sessions?
No, before Sessions. We used to call him Judge. And that's all that's coming to my mind. I'll think of it in a minute. But by the time he got up and said, my grandfather was a general in the Confederate Army.
Heflin.
Hal Heflin, right. Howard Heflin. When Judge Heflin got up and said, my grandfather was a general in the Confederate Army and we're proud of our Confederate heritage, but this symbol has no place in society today. Because it inflames passions and reminds African, Black Americans of their pain. And when he did that, I think he must have brought a whole, to the extent that we had Southern support at all, he was really the logjam, the emotional logjam breaker in all of that. And that's how it was. I mean, the Senate, we wound up winning 78, 70, I don't know what the vote exactly, but it was better than 70 votes.
In all of these things, in that fight, when you served as ambassador, which is entirely different from being a senator or a legislator, and when you're in the legislature, and even before that, recorder of deeds, whatever it is, is there some kind of vision you have that you bring to your work? You talked before about, doing the best where you're planted. But is there a vision that covers everything that you've done? Or does it change over time? Do you have a different vision now, say, than you did when you were a young state legislator?
Well, it hasn't exactly changed in the really broad outlines. It's changed, obviously, in the specifics and in the details. But in the most sweeping generalization I can make, it's like that old gospel, I don't know if it's gospel or blues, to be honest, but that old song about you got to serve somebody. It might be the devil and it might be the Lord, but you got to serve somebody.
Yes.
And that really has been my, for me, I have found my life path as one of a challenge of being able to serve the higher values, to serve in ways that give my life meaning as having weighed in on the forces for good. And, I used to tell my son, as Dr. King had an expression about the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And I used to tell my son, but that depends on people making it bend towards justice. And if we don't weigh in, each of us, in our way, in whatever endeavor it is that we undertake, to bend it towards justice, to make it go in the direction of truth, to lead it in the direction of the higher values, then it won't.